My name is Jake Morrison. I'm 32 years old, and this all happened one fateful October weekend in 2019 in the heart of Florida's Ocala National Forest. I had been itching for an escape from the relentless pace of city life, and when my three closest friends, Alex Reed, Marissa Mari Chen, and Derek D. Carter, suggested a spontaneous RV camping trip, I couldn't resist. We craved adventure, good company, and a break from our everyday worries. Little did we know that the forest held dark secrets that would turn our getaway into a living nightmare. We set off early Friday morning, loaded with camping gear, plenty of snacks, and high hopes for a weekend of exploration. I was driving our beat-up but trusty RV, a relic from my early days of adventuring, and the mood inside was buoyant. Alex, with his ever-present daredevil glint, was the first to crack jokes about our old mobile possibly breaking down in the middle of nowhere. Mari, our resident lore expert, spent most of the drive recounting eerie tales of local legends, particularly the story of a wronged witch whose vengeful spirit was rumored to haunt these very woods. D, the gadget guy, fiddled with every piece of equipment at hand, from our portable generator to our handheld GPS, reassuring us that technology would be our lifeline. After several hours on winding back roads flanked by towering pines and murky wetlands, we finally arrived at a secluded clearing deep within the forest. The RV's arrival stirred a mix of relief and anticipation. As we unloaded our gear, I couldn't help but notice that the generator's light flickered uncertainly, a small omen that we brushed off as nothing more than the age of our equipment. The early evening was deceptively calm. The gentle hum of cicadas and the rustle of leaves in the mild October breeze created a soothing backdrop. We set up camp, decided on a central clearing near an ancient oak, and planned to start our evening with a casual campfire. I remember feeling a slight chill, not entirely from the dropping temperatures, but as if the forest itself was exhaling a quiet warning. Mari wandered a short distance from our campsite, her curiosity piqued by something in the underbrush. Later, she returned, her eyes wide, pointing out strange weathered symbols carved into the bark of that old oak. The marks were archaic, almost ritualistic, and instantly connected in her mind with the local legends she'd been researching. As dusk melted into night, the atmosphere shifted, the shadows lengthened, and the forest's sounds began to take on an eerie quality. We sat around the dying campfire, the silence punctuated by distant, indistinct whispers that might have been the wind, or something else entirely. Alex, ever the skeptic, dismissed our unease with a laugh, but I caught the tension in his eyes. D's confident banter about technology was tinged with worry as his devices began malfunctioning, leaving us with nothing more than the flickering light of our dying fire and our mounting apprehension. The first real sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. I was lying on a cot in the RV, struggling to find sleep amid the cacophony of strange sounds outside. At first, it was just the wind, but then I heard it, a soft, deliberate rustling, as if someone was dragging something heavy just beyond the door. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and fumbled for my flashlight. The beam swept across the cramped interior of the RV, but nothing appeared out of the ordinary. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, yet the persistent noise made it clear that I was not alone. I stepped outside into the cold night air, my breath coming out in visible puffs. The clearing was shrouded in darkness, and the failing light from the RV offered little comfort. That's when I saw it, a dark silhouette at the edge of the tree line, moving with a deliberate, unnerving grace. The figure was vaguely human in shape, yet its movements were too fluid, too unnatural. I called out softly, but no response came. The presence of it sent a shudder down my spine. I returned to the RV, where I found Alex pacing restlessly. "Did you see that?" I asked. Voice trembling slightly, he grunted, his bravado momentarily slipping. "Yeah, I did. Or thought I did," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Mari, who had been scribbling in her notebook, looked up with a mix of excitement and fear. "It's exactly as the legend described," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The Shade of Ocala. They say it's the restless spirit of a witch who was betrayed and executed centuries ago." D, usually the pragmatic one, was unusually quiet, his face pale in the dim light. The next few hours were a blur of rising tension and mounting dread. The RV's generator sputtered and died completely, plunging us into darkness. We were forced to rely on flashlights and the faint glow of our smartphones, though even those seemed to falter against the oppressive blackness of the forest. The isolation was palpable. Our attempts to contact the outside world were futile. The devices which D had trusted so implicitly had gone silent. Then came the unexplainable phenomena. I remember lying awake on the RV's narrow bed when I first heard the sound of soft, almost melodic humming echoing through the trees. It was accompanied by the faintest whisper of a child's laughter, a sound so innocent yet so chilling that it froze me in place. I glanced at the others, who were equally unnerved. Alex tried to joke it off, but his forced chuckle betrayed his unease. Mari's eyes shone with a mix of scholarly intrigue and genuine terror, while D's hands shook as he tried, unsuccessfully, to coax some life back into his dead devices. By the time we gathered near the campfire outside the RV, the forest had transformed into a labyrinth of distorted shapes and looming silhouettes. In the periphery of my vision, I kept catching glimpses of something moving, always just out of reach, always too fast to be properly seen. Then suddenly, the air was filled with the sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush. We all froze, listening as the noise retreated into the darkness, leaving behind only the sound of our rapid breathing and the eerie echo of that unknown presence. The group's tension reached a boiling point. Mari argued that these were clear signs of the witch's curse, a spectral force that had been driven to rage ever since her tragic end. Alex, struggling to maintain his usual bravado, insisted that our minds were playing tricks on us in the dark. D, who had always trusted technology to ground him in reality, was now visibly shaken, repeatedly checking his equipment as if expecting it to suddenly reveal the truth. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on me as the de facto leader. I knew that we had to make a decision. Either we left immediately or we stayed and tried to confront the situation head-on. We decided, somewhat hesitantly, to investigate further. I volunteered to lead a small party. Alex and Mari accompanied me, while D stayed behind with the RV, reluctantly agreeing to monitor our return route using his malfunctioning devices. Armed with flashlights, a few cameras, and Mari's well-worn notebook filled with folklore and ritual instructions, we ventured into the darkness. Every step away from the RV deepened the sense of foreboding that hung heavily in the humid air. As we trekked deeper into the forest, the natural sounds seemed to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence punctuated by the occasional inexplicable rustling. The moon hung low, its pale light barely penetrating the thick canopy overhead. It was then that we saw it again, a figure standing motionless among the trees. Unlike before, this time the figure seemed more defined, almost human in its outline, yet unmistakably otherworldly. Its eyes, if one could call them that, glinted with an eerie light and its form wavered like a heat haze. "Do you see that?" I whispered, barely able to contain the dread in my voice. Alex nodded, his face stricken with both fear and a wild curiosity. Mari's eyes widened as she murmured, "It's her, the witch, the shade of Ocala." We stood frozen, our collective, breath mingling with the cold night air. For a long moment the figure simply watched us as if measuring our souls, before it slowly began to move, gliding away, its motions unnaturally smooth and deliberate. Our pursuit was hesitant at first, each of us taking careful steps behind the spectral figure, our flashlights darting across the forest floor. The chase led us to a small clearing where the air felt different, heavier somehow. There we stumbled upon remnants of what appeared to be an old campsite. Charred logs, scattered belongings, and more inexplicable symbols carved into nearby rocks. It was as if we had entered a time capsule of forgotten rituals and unspeakable tragedies. In the center of the clearing lay a crude stone altar, and as I approached it, a chill that wasn't entirely due to the October air washed over me. The symbols on the rocks and trees, The ritualistic placement of objects all seemed to confirm Mari's fervent belief in the legend. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, while Alex's eyes darted around nervously. "We should go back," he muttered, but there was a tremor in his voice that belied his confident facade. It wasn't long before the supernatural presence began to manifest its malevolence more aggressively. I remember feeling an almost physical force pushing against me as I tried to turn back, as if the very forest were determined to keep us there. In that moment, the quiet became punctuated with sudden, violent gusts of wind that knocked me off balance and sent loose debris tumbling across the clearing. I scrambled to regain my footing, my mind racing with thoughts of the witch's curse and the vengeful spirit that might be exacting retribution on any who disturbed its resting place. Our return to the RV was anything but straightforward. The forest seemed to conspire against us. Branches snagged our clothing and unseen forces disoriented our sense of direction. At one point, Alex stumbled, and before I could catch him, something struck him from the shadows, a force so violent it left him crumpled on the forest floor, moaning in pain. I rushed to his side, my heart pounding as I saw a deep gash along his arm. His eyes were wide with shock and pain, and I realized that our supernatural adversary was not merely a spectral presence but something capable of inflicting real, tangible harm. Back at the RV, Dee's anxious face greeted us as we stumbled through the doorway, bloodied and shaken. He barely had time to close the door behind us before we huddled together, illuminated by the shaky beams of our flashlights. Alex's injury was severe, and while Dee did his best to tend to it with a first aid kit, the gravity of our situation sank in. The forest had become a malevolent entity, determined to trap us in its web of terror. As we attempted to regroup and make sense of what had transpired, Mari spread out her research on the RV's table. She recounted the legend of the Shade of Yar, Ocala in hushed tones, the tale of a witch betrayed by her kin and executed in a fit of superstition, her spirit cursed to wander the forest in search of retribution. According to her research, the witch had been known to exact vengeance on those who inadvertently disturbed her sanctuary, using both psychological terror and physical violence as instruments of her curse. The evidence, both in the folklore and in our recent encounters, was mounting. Fear, anger, and despair battled within our small group. We were faced with a choice: either attempt to confront and possibly banish the spirit using a ritual Mari had painstakingly documented, or gather what we could and flee, hoping to escape with our lives. The decision tore at us. Alex, whose bravado had masked his underlying fear, argued for immediate escape, while Mari was resolute in her belief that understanding and appeasing the spirit was our only hope. I found myself torn between the instinct to survive and the need to uncover the truth behind the relentless terror that haunted us. In a desperate bid for control, we decided to try the ritual. Mari's instructions were detailed yet fraught with uncertainty, a mixture of ancient lore and modern interpretation. We gathered around a makeshift circle marked out by stones and twigs near the RV, the fading embers of our campfire casting long, distorted shadows on our faces. Dee, though still shaken by the breakdown of his equipment, helped set up a few essential items: a few candles, some salt, and an old, tattered book that Mari had borrowed from a local historian. As we recited the incantations in a trembling chorus, the air grew charged with an electric tension. At first, nothing happened. Then the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The silence of the night was shattered by a cacophony of unnatural sounds: the rustling of leaves that sounded like whispered curses, and the sharp, intermittent crack of branches snapping as though in anger. My heart pounded as I felt a pressure building in the clearing, a force that seemed to converge upon us. In the midst of our ritual, the spectral figure reappeared, this time more tangible and horrifying than ever before. Its eyes burned with a malevolent intensity, and its form twisted and contorted as if caught between the realms of the living and the dead. The entity's presence was overwhelming. It advanced toward us with a speed that defied logic, and the very ground beneath our feet trembled as it neared. In that desperate moment, I felt an almost paralyzing terror. Alex, whose earlier bravado had crumbled, screamed as the apparition lashed out with a force that sent him sprawling backwards. I reached out instinctively, trying to shield him, but the entity's violent assault was indiscriminate. Mari's incantations grew frantic, her voice cracking with both determination and terror, as she desperately tried to command the spirit to recede. For what felt like an eternity, chaos reigned in that moonlit clearing. The air was filled with a maddening blend of sound and fury, the clash of our desperate shouts against the relentless, otherworldly roar of the spirit. I could see the anger and pain etched into the entity's contorted features, a mirror of the centuries-old injustice that had birthed it. Amid the melee, Dee's attempts to salvage his failing equipment were futile, as the supernatural assault rendered all technology powerless. In the midst of this maelstrom of terror, I found myself locked in a silent struggle, not only against the physical menace that threatened us, but also against the creeping realization that our actions might be fueling its rage. The ritual circle, once a symbol of hope, became the battleground where ancient grievances met modern desperation. With one final desperate surge, Mari raised her hands and recited the final lines of the incantation. A blinding flash of light erupted from the circle, and for a moment everything was engulfed in searing brilliance. When the light faded, the entity was gone, or so we hoped. The aftermath was a mix of relief and profound sorrow. Alex lay injured, but breathing, and though his arm was badly wounded, we had managed to stave off further physical harm. The forest, however, seemed to have retained its oppressive silence, as if the anger of the witch was momentarily abated, but far from extinguished. We huddled together inside the RV, tending to our wounds and trying to make sense of the surreal events that had upended our lives. There was no sense of victory, only the heavy burden of having confronted a darkness that defied explanation. In the days that followed, the forest continued to haunt our every step. We managed to limp our way back to civilization, but the terror of that night lingered in every shadow, every whispered sound, and every flicker of light. I kept a detailed journal, chronicling not only the sequence of events but also the deep emotional scars that were left behind. Every now and then, when I looked out of my window or walked past a darkened alley, I swore I saw a familiar spectral figure lurking just at the edge of my vision, a reminder that the shade of Ocala was not truly banished. The incident forced me to reevaluate my relationship with the world around me. The natural beauty of Florida, once a source of solace and wonder, had revealed a sinister side, a reminder that beneath the veneer of everyday life, there are forces older and more mysterious than we can comprehend. For months after that harrowing weekend, sleep eluded me. I was tormented by nightmares of ancient curses and vengeful spirits, and the memory of Mari's frantic face, Alex's pained screams, and Dee's silent terror replayed over and over in my mind. Eventually, I came to terms with the fact that our encounter had changed us irrevocably. The supernatural terror we had experienced was not a mere figment of collective hysteria. It was real, and its origins lay buried in the dark history of a land steeped in myth and tragedy. I now understand that the legend of the wronged witch was more than just a story. It was a living, breathing curse that had reached out from the depths of time to reclaim its due. In the quiet moments of reflection, as I scribbled down these memories in my journal, I realized that the true horror of that weekend was not solely the terror we endured, but the haunting knowledge that some evils are eternal. The shade of Ocala may have been forced to retreat, but its presence lingers in the rustle of the pines and the whisper of the wind, and in the dark recesses of my soul. As I drive the RV down the highway, leaving behind the cursed clearing of Ocala National Forest, I can still feel that oppressive presence following us, a silent specter on the edge of perception. I know that I will never forget the terror of that night, nor will I ever be the same. The experience taught me that sometimes the price of seeking adventure is far higher than one could ever imagine, and that in the depths of nature, the line between myth and reality is dangerously thin. Now, whenever I return to a quiet corner of the world, I remain vigilant, always listening for the faintest whisper in the dark, and forever wary of the shadows that may conceal more than just the absence of light. My name is Jake Morrison. I'm 32 years old, and I carry with me the burden of having seen the unexplainable. And in every silent moonlit night, I can't help but wonder if the witch's curse has simply been lying dormant, waiting for its next chance to rise again from the depths of the haunted Ocala. My name is Ethan Price, I'm 35 years old, and this all happened in the autumn of 2018 when I sought solitude and perhaps a sliver of redemption deep in Florida's Withlacoochee State Forest. I had spent years tormented by guilt and memories of a tragedy that stole away the person I once was. I wasn't a stranger to pain, but that summer had left scars that refused to fade. With a battered old RV as my only companion, I left behind the city, a maze of constant reminders of what I'd lost, in hopes that the forest's quiet isolation might help me piece together the shattered remnants of my soul. I had chosen this journey deliberately. My mind was heavy with regret over decisions made in haste, words left unsaid, and a love that slipped away before I could truly understand its value. I'd read somewhere that nature has a way of healing, of whispering forgotten truths to those who are willing to listen. So, with a half-worn leather journal in hand and the persistent echo of old memories in my head, I set out in my creaking RV towards Withlacoochee State Forest, a place renowned for its dense, haunting woodlands and legends that spoke of restless spirits and ancient curses. The journey was long and reflective. The asphalt gave way to winding back roads framed by towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. I remember watching the landscape shift, feeling both a physical and emotional distance from the chaos I'd left behind. As dusk fell on the first day, I found a secluded clearing just off a narrow trail. The forest here was thick and silent, as if it had been holding its breath for centuries. I parked my RV beside a small patch of flat ground, where gnarled trees loomed like silent sentinels. I set up a modest camp, an old folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and a small portable stove, and took a long, slow walk to familiarize myself with the surroundings. That first night, I was unnerved by the feeling that I was not alone. I lay, awake listening to the whisper of wind through the leaves, and I could have sworn I heard soft footsteps circling the RV. At first I dismissed it as the sound of animals moving in the underbrush, but there was a deliberate quality to those noises that kept me on edge. Before dawn, drawn by an inexplicable impulse, I stepped outside with my flashlight and discovered something that sent a shiver down my spine. Near the base of a massive oak, I found a series of strange, archaic symbols etched into the bark. They were not random scratches, but deliberate markings, almost like runes that spoke of a forgotten language. Their faint glow in the pre-dawn light made them seem almost alive, as if they were pulsing with a hidden energy. I couldn't help but wonder if they were connected to the local legends I had read about, tales of echoes of the forgotten, the restless spirits of those doomed to wander these woods. As the sun rose, I spent the morning quietly scribbling down my thoughts in my journal. The forest, although beautiful, carried an air of melancholy. Every rustle, every distant creak of a branch felt like a soft murmur of secrets. I recalled fragments of local lore, that the forest had once been the site of a small settlement whose inhabitants met untimely, tragic ends. Some said the souls of those who suffered were still bound to the land, yearning to be heard. The symbolism etched into the oak only deepened that notion, stirring memories of my own unresolved guilt. Over the next few days, the forest began to reveal its mysteries in ways that blurred the line between my troubled memories and the supernatural. I drove the RV cautiously along narrow, unpaved roads, each turn revealing denser groves and eerie clearings that seemed to whisper my name. At night, the silence was punctuated by odd, almost musical hums, and the soft cadence of footsteps on gravel. In one particularly long night, as I lay on the worn mattress in the RV, I was awakened by a series of rhythmic knocks on the door. The sound was deliberate, like a message meant only for me. I crept to the door and peeked out into the darkness, but saw nothing, only the inky blackness of the forest and the faint outline of trees that swayed in the cold wind. I began to experience moments of disorientation. I would find myself standing by the RV in the early morning mist, unsure if I had actually stepped outside, or if it was some hallucination brought on by my restless mind. The symbols on the oak, seemed to shift and change subtly, and sometimes I caught brief glimpses of faces in the bark, fleeting, sorrowful images that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The forest was speaking to me, and I wasn't entirely sure if it was echoing my own inner torment or if it was something far older and more malevolent. One humid afternoon, while following a narrow, overgrown trail that veered off from my RV, I stumbled upon an abandoned cabin hidden beneath a canopy of overgrown vines and twisted branches. The cabin's wooden exterior was weathered by time, its windows dark and empty. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of light that broke through broken boards. As I explored the derelict space, I discovered an old, leather-bound journal on a rickety table. The pages were brittle with age, and the ink had faded in places, but the words leapt off the page with urgent clarity. The journal recounted the history of a family cursed by misfortune, tales of a lineage doomed to suffer loss and sorrow, their voices silenced by a malevolent force that dwelled within the forest. The entries detailed ritualistic attempts to appease these spirits, to offer them solace and perhaps a chance at redemption. I read of desperate pleas to ancient gods and whispered incantations meant to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. The more I read, the more I felt that my own life, my own burden of guilt and loss, was intertwined with the fate of those long-forgotten souls. Each night after that discovery, the phenomena grew more intense. I would sit in the RV's dim light, reading by a small lantern, when I'd hear disembodied voices echoing through the trees, a mixture of sorrowful wails and gentle murmurs that seemed to beckon me outside. In my sleep, I was plagued by vivid flashbacks that merged my past with surreal, ghostly visions. I saw the face of a woman I once loved, her eyes filled with both love and unspoken sorrow, and I heard her calling my name in a voice that trembled with both accusation and forgiveness. These visions were never entirely comforting. They brought with them a flood of emotions I had long buried. I began to suspect that the forest was not merely a passive backdrop, but an active participant in my journey, a mirror reflecting my inner demons. The symbolism in the forest was relentless. Every evening, as I sat by the dwindling light of my portable stove, I would study the strange markings on nearby rocks and trees. They seemed to form a cryptic language, one that I tried desperately to decipher using the clues from the journal I had found. There was an inexplicable resonance between the inscriptions and the fragments of my own memories, scenes of love lost, moments of regret, and the overwhelming weight of remorse. I started to document everything meticulously in my journal, hoping that by piecing together the puzzle, I might finally understand the curse that bound both the forest and my own soul. I knew that I had reached a turning point. The forest was no longer a passive sanctuary. It had become a living, breathing force that demanded engagement. Convinced that the echoes of the forgotten were not merely echoes of the past, but active spirits yearning for resolution, I decided to attempt the ritual described in the journal. I spent days preparing, gathering natural elements, marking out a circle of stones near the ancient oak, where I first saw the glowing symbols, and gathering a few candles and scraps of old cloth. I wasn't entirely sure what I was about to do, but something deep inside me insisted that if I was ever to find redemption, I needed to face these specters head-on. That fateful night was the most turbulent I had ever experienced. A storm was gathering overhead, dark clouds churning and swallowing the remaining light. I set up my makeshift altar in a small clearing encircled by ancient trees, whose branches seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. The air was charged with anticipation and fear as I arranged the candles in a rough circle, their flickering flames casting erratic shadows on the ground. I laid out the symbols I had painstakingly documented, aligning them with the markings on the oak I had discovered earlier. My hands trembled as I unrolled the fragile pages of the journal and began to recite the incantations written there, words that were foreign, yet somehow deeply personal, as if they were meant solely for me. As I spoke, the wind picked up violently, and the storm broke overhead with a furious roar. The rain lashed against the clearing, and lightning split the sky in jagged arcs. The trees shuddered as if in pain, and for a moment, I felt that the very earth was crying out. In the midst of the tempest, I sensed a presence drawing near, a palpable force that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I felt my heart pounding so fiercely I feared it would burst from my chest. The atmosphere around me shifted, and the comforting, steady cadence of the incantation was drowned out by an overwhelming cacophony of whispers and moans that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the forest. Then, in the center of my circle, as the storm's fury reached its peak, I saw her. A spectral figure materialized out of the swirling rain and darkness, a vision that was both beautiful and heart-wrenching. In that flickering moment of clarity, I recognized the face of the woman I had lost, the one whose smile had once filled my life with hope, and whose sudden absence had plunged me into despair. But this was not a gentle apparition. It was a tempest of sorrow and accusation. Her eyes, luminous with an otherworldly glow, bore into mine, and for a heartbeat, I felt as if every ounce of my guilt was laid bare before her. The apparition's presence was overwhelming, a tangible force that seemed to physically push against me, demanding that I confront the pain I had so long avoided. I staggered backwards, my voice catching in my throat as I tried to continue the ritual. The spectral figure advanced slowly, her form wavering like smoke caught in a gust. I could see the anguish etched on her face, the same anguish I had felt in my own heart for years. "Ethan," her voice whispered, echoing both in the howling wind and deep within my mind. "You must forgive yourself." The words were both an accusation and a plea, carrying the weight of a lifetime of regrets. In that surreal moment, the storm around me seemed to subside just enough for her to come closer, until it felt as if she were hovering directly before me, her gaze intense and unyielding. I found myself at a crossroads. The ritual, intended to appease the restless spirit and perhaps release me from my own torment, was forcing me to confront a truth I had long buried. Every line of my incantation became a desperate confession, a recitation of my failures, my regrets, and the immense guilt that had shadowed me for so long. As I spoke the final words, my voice cracked with emotion. The spectral figure's eyes softened slightly, and for a moment, the oppressive energy in the clearing seemed to lift. I realized then that this encounter was not solely about banishing a ghost or dispelling a curse. It was about accepting the past and finding a way to forgive myself. For what felt like an eternity, time stood still. The spirit's form flickered, caught between anger and sorrow, as if she were both the embodiment of my loss and the keeper of my salvation. Then slowly, her image began to dissolve into the mist, her final whisper trailing off into the night. "Forgive and be free." The wind calmed and the storm's fury receded into a distant rumble. I stood alone in the circle, drenched by rain and trembling with a mix of terror and relief. In that profound moment of catharsis, I felt an unexpected lightness in my chest, a glimmer of hope that perhaps the years of self-condemnation could finally begin to heal. In the aftermath of the ritual, the forest returned to its eerie silence. The supernatural disturbances that had haunted my nights for days seemed to have ceased, leaving behind a calm that was both unnerving and peaceful. I spent a long time in that clearing, sitting beneath the ancient oak, trying to absorb the enormity of what had just transpired. The journal, now clutched tightly in my hands, served as a reminder of the old voices that once echoed through these woods, voices that for a brief, bittersweet moment had granted me the forgiveness I so desperately needed. The next morning, the storm had passed, and a soft golden light filtered through the trees. I stepped out of the RV and felt the cool, fresh air on my skin, a stark contrast to the oppressive humidity of the night before. The forest, which had seemed a realm of darkness and despair, now looked almost serene, bathed in the gentle hues of dawn. I gathered my meager belongings, and with one last lingering look at the clearing that had both tormented and healed me, I started the RV's engine. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years I felt a sense of renewal, a tentative promise that the past no longer held me captive. As I drove along the narrow, winding roads of Withlacoochee State Forest, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had transpired. The echoes of that night, the spectral whisper, the shifting symbols, the overwhelming surge of emotions, remained with me, not as a torment, but as a guide. I had been forced to face the darkest corners of my soul, to admit my mistakes and to let go of the burdens that had weighed me down for so long. In doing so, I had found a semblance of peace amid the ghostly remnants of lost lives and shattered dreams. Now, as I continue my journey, I carry with me not just the memory of a haunted forest, but the deep understanding that sometimes true healing comes from confronting one's own inner demons. The echoes of the forgotten are not simply the restless souls of those who suffered long ago. They are reflections of our own hidden pain, waiting to be acknowledged and eventually forgiven. And as I press on along the open road, with the forest slowly receding in my rearview mirror, I feel the gentle promise of a new beginning, a life where the scars of the past no longer dictate the path ahead. My journey through Withlacoochee State Forest remains one of the most transformative experiences of my life. In its quiet depths, among ancient trees and mysterious symbols, I discovered that redemption is not found in denying our past, but in embracing it with all its sorrow and beauty. Though I still carry the weight of those memories, I now understand that every step forward is a testament to the strength found in forgiveness. The forest's silent lessons continue to echo in my heart, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, there is the possibility of dawn. I drive on, the RV rumbling steadily beneath me, and as I glance at the horizon, I see the promise of a future unburdened by the ghosts of yesterday. The road may be long and uncertain, but I no longer fear what lies ahead. I have faced the echoes of my past, and in doing so, I have reclaimed a piece of myself that I thought was forever lost. And in every quiet moment, whether in the stillness of a starry night or the gentle hum of the RV's engine, I know that I am finally free. This journey, marked by both terror and transformation, has taught me that the line between the supernatural and our own inner turmoil is often blurred. The forest was not merely a backdrop for my escape, but an active, living force that challenged me to confront my deepest regrets. And while I may never completely silence the echoes of that long-ago tragedy, I have learned to live with them, to honor the lessons they brought, and to carry forward the hope that even the most haunted soul can find a way to heal. Now, as I continue my solitary travels, I document each step in my journal, not as a record of pain, but as a chronicle of recovery. The lessons learned amid the towering trees and whispering winds of Withlacoochee State Forest remain etched in my memory, a permanent reminder that the journey to forgiveness is as winding and unpredictable as the forest itself. And every time I see a glimmer of light filtering through the dense canopy or hear the distant call of a nightbird, I remember that in the quiet spaces of the world, and within the depths of our own hearts, there is always the chance to begin again. My name is Ethan Price, and though my past will forever be a part of who I am, I now walk a path of hope, courage, and redemption. The echoes of that transformative night will always guide me, whispering softly that every end, no matter how haunted, is merely the beginning of something new. My name is Lucas Reed. I'm 30 years old, and this all happened in the fall of 2020 when I decided to escape the ghosts of my past by taking my old RV deep into Florida's Big Cypress National Preserve. I had left behind the chaos of the city and the haunting memories of a military mission that went terribly wrong. A mission that cost lives and left me burdened with guilt I could never quite shake. I hoped that in the vast isolation of the swamp, I might finally find some solace or even a shred of redemption. The drive out to Big Cypress was long and lonesome. I remember the endless stretches of blacktop giving way to winding, unpaved roads, the horizon broken only by towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. I'd packed my battered leather journal, my most trusted companion, along with a few essentials and some old photographs that I couldn't bear to look at, yet felt compelled to carry as reminders of what I'd lost. My RV, a relic from better days, rattled and groaned as if echoing my own inner turmoil. Every bump in the road sent a jolt through my heart, a reminder of how fragile life can be. After several hours of driving, I finally found a secluded clearing beside a slow-moving, murky stream. The clearing was barely visible through the dense vegetation, a perfect place for a man seeking to disappear into the wilderness. I parked the RV on a slightly raised patch of ground. From there, I could see the swamp stretching out in every direction, its dark waters and tangled trees hinting at secrets long kept. As I set up my modest camp, I couldn't help but notice that the RV's engine coughed out a series of sputters, and the radio, which usually played a weak country tune, began to fill with bursts of static and unintelligible voices. Even the ER clock on the dashboard seemed to lag behind, its hands moving erratically. I chalked it up to old age and the harsh environment, but a part of me felt that these technical glitches were more than mere coincidences. That first night in the swamp was eerily silent, punctuated only by the croaks of unseen creatures and the constant hum of insects. I sat on the worn steps of the RV, nursing a cup of coffee, and scribbled in my journal about the surreal beauty and the underlying sense of foreboding that the preserve exuded. As darkness deepened, a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air crept over me. I'd barely begun to settle in when I heard it, a soft, deliberate knocking on the side of my RV. I froze, heart pounding, convinced that it was nothing more than a trick of my weary imagination. But when I stepped outside with my flashlight in hand, the knock had stopped, leaving only the oppressive silence of the swamp. I walked around the RV slowly, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Near one of the tires, partially hidden by creeping vines and fallen leaves, I noticed something odd, a small weathered envelope wedged into the gap between the tire and the ground. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The envelope was stained and brittle with age, and inside I found an old, faded photograph of a group of people standing in front of what looked like a dilapidated shack. Tucked beneath the photograph was a handwritten note in spidery ink. "Remember us, forgive, and be free." I couldn't tell if it was meant for me or for someone long dead. The mystery of it stirred something deep within me, a mixture of curiosity and dread that I couldn't easily dismiss. The following morning, the swamp greeted me with a thick, humid mist and an unsettling stillness. I decided to take a walk around my campsite, hoping that the early light would dispel some of the eerie sensations of the previous night. As I wandered along a narrow trail bordered by gnarled roots and moss-covered trees, I came across a particularly ancient cypress. Its trunk was swollen and scarred, and etched into its rough bark were strange symbols that seemed almost deliberate in their design. I knelt down and ran my fingers over the markings. They were not random scratches, but something akin to runes, from a forgotten language. The symbols appeared to glow faintly in the soft light of dawn, as if they were imbued with some hidden power. I snapped a few photos and made detailed notes in my journal, wondering if they were connected in any way to the envelope and its cryptic message. Over the next few days, life in the swamp became increasingly surreal. I began to notice that the clearing around my RV was not as constant as I'd thought. Sometimes when I returned from a short trek, objects would have shifted slightly. An empty can here, a misplaced log there. At first I assumed it was the work of small animals or the relentless force of nature rearranging the debris of the forest floor. But as the days passed, I became less certain. The sense of being watched grew stronger. I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a flash of something passing silently among the trees. And then, when I turned to look directly, nothing would be there. Sleep became elusive. In the quiet of the night, the RV's interior filled with the disquieting chorus of distant sounds, the rustle of leaves, the drip of water from unseen sources, and, at times, a soft murmur that almost resembled voices. I began to experience vivid flashbacks of my military service. In one instance, I awoke to the sound of distant artillery fire, the smell of burning fuel, and the ghostly echo of orders given in a voice that seemed both familiar and impossible to place. These weren't merely nightmares. They were immersive, sensory memories that blurred the line between past and present. I wondered if the swamp was somehow dredging up memories I'd long tried to bury, or if my mind was simply fracturing under the isolation. On a particularly sweltering afternoon, driven by a need to escape the oppressive confines of the RV, I decided to explore further afield. I followed a barely discernible trail that wound its way through dense underbrush, the air heavy with the scent of decay and rich, dark earth. After an hour's walk, I stumbled upon an abandoned shack hidden away in a thicket. Its wooden exterior was weathered and broken, the paint peeling in large, sorrowful strips, and the windows were dark like the empty eyes of a long-forgotten relic. The air around it felt charged, as if the building itself were a repository of long-held secrets. Inside the shack, dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that managed to break through the gaps in the boarded-up windows. I discovered a small table cluttered with remnants of a past life, a rusted lantern, faded maps, and a leather-bound journal whose pages were yellowed and brittle. I carefully flipped through the journal and found entries detailing the history of a clandestine group of early settlers who had taken refuge in the swamp. According to the entries, these people were not ordinary folk. They were seekers, dabbling in occult practices in an effort to transcend time and memory. Their writings spoke of rituals meant to bridge the gap between the living and the dead, of voices from the past that could be called forth with the proper incantations, and of a profound connection between the sorrow of lost souls and the natural energies of the swamp. Reading their desperate words, I felt an eerie kinship with these long-departed souls. In many ways, their grief and longing echoed my own inner turmoil. Every evening after that discovery, I returned to my RV with a growing sense of dread, mixed with a strange, irresistible pull. I spent hours in the dim light of a small lantern, poring over the journal's entries and comparing the cryptic symbols I had documented with those carved into the trees near my camp. There were uncanny parallels between the ancient rites described in the journal and the personal memories I had long tried to forget. Memories of missions gone awry, of friends lost, and of choices made in the heat of battle that continued to haunt my every waking moment. As the isolation deepened, I began to feel that the swamp was not simply a silent observer, but an active force in my unraveling. My RV, once a sanctuary on wheels, now felt like a prison surrounded by unseen eyes. The radio, which had once sputtered with static, now occasionally crackled with disjointed voices that whispered fragments of sentences, snatches of conversations I couldn't quite make out, but which seemed to mirror the words in the old journal. At night, as I lay awake, I often heard soft murmurs drifting on the humid air, murmurs that seemed to beckon me to remember and forgive. It was as though the swamp itself was urging me to confront the demons I had long tried to bury. The climax of my descent into this distorted reality came on a night when the heavens unleashed a torrential downpour. I had been sitting inside the RV, reading and writing by the weak glow of a battery-powered lamp, when the sound of rain pounding on the roof was suddenly interrupted by a powerful gust of wind. The temperature plummeted, and the steady rhythm of the rain turned into an erratic, almost violent assault. Something compelled me to leave the relative shelter of the RV and seek answers outside. I grabbed my flashlight and a worn, waterproof notebook and ventured out into the storm, following an inexplicable impulse that led me toward the abandoned shack. The night was a maelstrom of sound and fury. Rain whipped past me, stinging my face, and the wind howled through the trees as if lamenting lost souls. The path to the shack was nearly obscured by the downpour, yet I pressed on, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally reached the shack, its silhouette loomed large and foreboding against the lightning-lit sky. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The interior was even darker than I remembered, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. In the flickering light of my solitary lantern, I felt a presence, a palpable force that seemed to press in from all sides. I set my notebook on an old splintered table and began to recite aloud a passage from the journal, one that described a ritual intended to communicate with the lost souls of the swamp. My voice trembled as I spoke the ancient words, each syllable resonating with a power I had never before experienced. As I recited the incantation, the oppressive atmosphere in the shack shifted, shadows deepened, and the air grew colder still, as if time itself were bending around me. Then amidst the swirling darkness I saw her. A spectral figure emerged slowly from the gloom, a woman whose face was both beautiful and heartbreakingly tragic. Her eyes shone with an ethereal light, and as she advanced, I could see that they were filled with sorrow and something akin to accusation. The figure seemed to embody the collective grief of the swamp and, in a way, the burden of my own guilt. Her presence was overwhelming. I felt every unspoken regret, every lost opportunity, and every moment of failure surge forth. Like a tidal wave, in that storm-lashed moment she spoke, her voice echoing both inside my head and in the very walls of the shack. "Lucas, remember, forgive, be free." I stood frozen, caught between terror and an inexplicable yearning. The apparitions, words reverberated through my soul, dredging up memories of a mission gone wrong, of comrades I had failed to save, and of the bitter guilt that had haunted me ever since. The spectral figure moved closer, her features shifting from sorrow to a fierce, almost unyielding intensity. The relentless storm outside seemed to mirror the tempest within me. I knew that I was being forced to confront my past, every mistake, every loss, if I ever hoped to find peace. The encounter was both a physical and emotional battle. My heart pounded so violently that it felt as though it would burst from my chest, and the cold, clammy air seemed to sap my strength. I tried to speak, to recite more of the ritual in hopes of understanding what was happening, but my voice faltered under the weight of the apparition's presence. With each passing second, the spectral woman grew clearer, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that left me exposed and raw. "Lucas," she whispered again, and this time, her voice was a blend of pain and compassion, demanding that I face the past I had tried so desperately to bury. In that pivotal moment, something within me shifted. Tears, unbidden and uncontrollable, began to stream down my face. I realized that I had spent so many years running from my memories, from the mistakes that had defined me. With a choked cry that was part anguish and part defiance, I began to confess aloud, confessing my regrets, my failures, and the overwhelming guilt that had kept me chained to the past. My words, raw and unfiltered, echoed in the empty shack, mingling with the sound of the raging storm outside. As I bared my soul, the spectral figure's expression softened. For a long, agonizing moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the apparition began to fade, dissolving into the mist that seeped through the broken windows, leaving behind only the echo of her final haunting words, "Forgive, and be free." In that moment of catharsis, the storm outside seemed to subside. The oppressive forces that had plagued the swamp, the strange, shifting reality, the disembodied murmurs, and even the malfunctioning radio in my RV, gradually receded. I remained, in the abandoned shack for what felt like hours, soaked to the bone and trembling not only from the cold, but from the raw surge of emotion that had just overtaken me. I clutched my waterproof notebook, writing furiously about the experience, trying to capture every detail of that surreal confrontation. When I finally left the shack, the rain had diminished to a steady drizzle. The swamp, though still mysterious and dark, no longer felt as hostile as it once had. The oppressive weight that had settled over me seemed to have lifted, replaced by a tentative sense of relief and, perhaps, hope. I returned to my RV slowly, every step a reminder that I had just faced the embodiment of my past. Inside the RV, the once erratic clock now ticked steadily, and the radio, though still crackling with static, had lost its eerie voices. It was as if the very fabric of the swamp had acknowledged my moment of reckoning. The next morning, as dawn broke over the murky expanse of Big Cypress, I stepped outside and felt the cool, gentle air on my skin, a stark contrast to the tumult of the night before. The fog was lifting, and the swamp revealed itself in a quiet, almost serene light. I sat on the steps of my RV, my journal open in my lap, and reflected on the night's events. I knew that the spectral encounter was not merely a trick of my overtaxed mind or the result of isolation. It was something real, something that had forced me to confront the darkest parts of myself. The voices in the radio, the shifting objects, the strange symbols on the trees, all of it had led me to this moment of painful clarity. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope that I might one day forgive myself for the past. I understood now that the swamp, with all its ancient mysteries and lingering echoes, was not solely a place of terror, it was also a place of healing. The lost souls that once wandered these darkened waters had, in a way, guided me to face my own inner demons. The spectral woman's parting words, "Forgive and be free," became a mantra that resonated deeply within me. I spent several more days in Big Cypress, not as a fugitive from my past, but as a man determined to begin the slow process of recovery. Each evening I would walk a little farther from the RV, sometimes even returning to the clearing near the abandoned shack to sit quietly among the trees and let the peaceful murmur of the swamp lull me into contemplation. The strange occurrences gradually ceased, and while I never completely lost the feeling that I was being watched by the unseen eyes of the preserve, that presence no longer instilled terror in me. Instead, it served as a reminder of the fragile boundary between memory and reality, a boundary that I was slowly learning to navigate. By the time I finally decided to leave, I felt changed. My journal was filled with the raw, unfiltered emotions of those harrowing nights, but it also held new entries filled with cautious optimism and the beginnings of self-forgiveness. I started the RV's engine one final time and drove away from the clearing, the swamp receding in my rearview mirror. I knew that the mysteries of Big Cypress would remain, its ancient secrets safe among the towering cypress trees and dark waters. Yet I also carried with me a profound lesson, that sometimes the path to healing lies not in forgetting the past, but in facing it with unflinching honesty. As the miles passed beneath the RV's tires, I allowed myself to reflect on all that had transpired. I was still haunted by memories of my military service, the weight of decisions made in the heat of conflict, and the lives that were lost because of my own mistakes. But now, those memories no longer held me captive. Instead, they became a part of my story. A story of a man who dared to venture into the heart of darkness and emerged with a newfound understanding of forgiveness. I continue to travel, still alone in my RV, yet forever changed by my time in the swamp. I write often in my journal, not as a record of pain, but as a chronicle of a journey toward self-acceptance. The whisper of the swamp, the echo of that spectral voice urging me to remember and forgive, remains with me always. A quiet reminder that even in the darkest places, there is the potential for light. My journey through Big Cypress National Preserve taught me that our inner demons can be as formidable as any external force, and that facing them head-on, though terrifying, is the only way to reclaim our future. As I drive along endless roads and witness new horizons, I carry with me the wisdom that sometimes the greatest enemy we face is the one within ourselves, and that by confronting it, we can finally begin to heal. Now, whenever I pause in a quiet stretch of road or watch the sunrise from a remote campsite, I remember that stormy night at the shack. I remember the spectral figure, her eyes filled with sorrow and fierce compassion, and I remember the words that set me free. The swamp taught me that redemption is not an easy path, but it is one worth taking. And as I continue my solitary journey, I hold on to that hard-won truth. To forgive oneself is to reclaim the future and to leave behind the shadows of the past. Drive on, the hum of the RV's engine a constant companion on this long road of healing, and I know that while the scars of yesterday may never completely vanish, they no longer define me. Instead, they serve as reminders of a man who once faced unimaginable darkness and emerged, bruised but unbroken, ready to forge a new path. My name is Lucas Reed, and though the ghosts of Big Cypress will always linger in my memory, I have learned that by embracing my past, I can finally step into the light of tomorrow.